Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. In this video, I'm going to discuss some of NASA's long history in Arctic junk science. In 2008, NASA's James Hansen predicted that the Arctic would be ice-free in 5 to 10 years. June 24, 2008, by Seth Borenstein, AP Science writer. NASA scientists, we're toast. We see a tipping point occurring right before our eyes, Hansen told the AP before the luncheon. The Arctic is the first tipping point, and it's occurring exactly the way we said it would. Hansen, echoing work by other scientists, said that in 5 to 10 years the Arctic will be free of sea ice in the summer. Longtime global warming skeptic Senator James Inhofe, Oklahoma, citing a recent poll, said in a statement, Hansen, Gore, and the media have been trumpeting man-made climate doom since the 1980s, but Americans are not buying it. But Representative Ed Markey, Democrat, Massachusetts, said, Dr. Hansen was right. 20 years later, we recognize him as a climate prophet. So the Democrats' climate prophet predicted that the Arctic would be ice-free sometime between 2013 and 2018. Obviously, that didn't happen. However, not to be outdone, President Obama's science advisor John Holdren one-upped James Hansen. Holdren predicted that the Arctic would actually be ice-free year-round. The North Pole doesn't get any sunlight for 6 months from mid-September until mid-March, but Holdren thought that somehow temperatures would remain above freezing for that entire time without receiving any sunlight. My car is currently buried under almost 2 feet of snow, and I'm thinking that both Hansen and Holdren were probably wrong. There seems to be no shortage of cold, freezing air coming down from the Arctic. As a result of the rather spectacular forecast failures, NASA's had to do some backtracking. This is an article from the NASA website from last year. New NASA research has found that increases in the rate at which Arctic sea ice grows in the winter may have partially slowed down the decline of the Arctic sea ice cover. I have no idea what partially slowed down means. NASA predicted that the Arctic would be ice-free no later than last year, and it didn't happen. Either the ice is gone as NASA predicted, or it isn't. Then the article goes on. As temperatures in the Arctic have warmed at double the pace of the rest of the planet, the expanse of frozen seawater that blankets the Arctic Ocean and neighboring seas has shrunk and thinned over the past 3 decades. End of summer Arctic sea ice extent has nearly halved since the early 1980s. Now comes the key sentence. A recent NASA study found that since 1958, the Arctic sea ice cover has lost on average around 2/3 of its thickness. Let's look now and see if that claim is true. Here's an article discussing that topic from the New York Times in 1958. October 19, 1958, the changing face of the Arctic. Some scientists estimate that the polar ice pack is 40% thinner and 12% less in area than it was a half-century ago, and that even within the lifetime of our children, the Arctic Ocean may open, enabling ships to sail over the North Pole, as the submarines Nautilus and Skate recently sailed under it. A ship bound from New York to Tokyo would save 2,500 miles. Although the idea that a solid ice sheet covers the central Arctic has lingered stubbornly in the popular fancy, the northern cap of ice worn by our planet is actually a thin crust, on the whole only about 7 feet thick over an ocean 2 miles deep. So in 1958 the Arctic was melting fast, and scientists were predicting an ice-free Arctic within a generation. And the article said that there was a popular misconception that Arctic ice was very thick, when in fact it was only about 7 feet or 2 meters thick. Now let's go back once again and look at the NASA article from December 6, 2018. It said that since 1958 the Arctic sea ice cover has lost an average of around 2/3 of its thickness. This is a thickness map for Arctic sea ice from the Danish Meteorological Institute as of December 6, 2018, the date of the NASA article. The green, yellow, and red on this map is ice which is more than 2 meters or 7 feet thick. As you can see, most of the ice in the Arctic basin is 2 or more meters thick. And of course all of the ice gets thicker as the winter goes on. December 6 is still fairly early in the winter. So the average thickness of the sea ice on this date was somewhere in the range of 2 meters, approximately the same as it was in 1958. Remember that NASA claimed that the ice had lost 2/3 of its thickness since 1958, but that simply doesn't appear to be true. Many people in 1958 believed that the ice in the central Arctic was very thick, but the New York Times pointed out in this article that that is not true. The ice wasn't very thick in 1958, and it isn't very thick now either. NASA's claim about the loss of ice thickness since 1958 is incorrect. Here is some more interesting data about Arctic sea ice extent from the 1985 DOE report on climate. This report is the predecessor to the UN IPCC reports. The graph shows Arctic sea ice extent going back to the year 1925, prepared by Vinnikov et al. You can see that Arctic sea ice extent dropped sharply from the mid-1920s until the mid-1950s, and then the ice started growing again around 1960. The New York Times article was from 1958, very close to the low point on this graph. So this graph is consistent with what was written in the 1958 New York Times article. Vinnikov then extended his graph by another 15 years in the 1990 IPCC report. So in this chart I merged the graph from the 1985 DOE report with the one from the 1990 IPCC report. Now we can see that the mid-1950s was the century low for Arctic sea ice extent. And we can also see that 1979 was the peak year. It's pretty clear that a lot of Arctic sea ice was lost between the 1920s and the mid-1950s, which is what the 1958 New York Times article stated. It's also clear that there was a large increase in sea ice from the mid-1950s until the late 1970s. Newspapers from the time corroborate the Vinnikov graphs. April 7, 1923, North Pole melting. Many glaciers vanished. Is the North Pole going to melt entirely? Are the Arctic regions warming up with the prospect of a great climatic change in that part of the world? Science is asking these questions. Reports from fishermen, seal hunters, and explorers who sailed the seas around Spitsbergen and the eastern Arctic all point to a radical change in climatic conditions with hitherto unheard of high temperatures on that part of the Earth's surface. December 17, 1939, Greenland's glaciers melting, says scientist. All the glaciers in eastern Greenland are rapidly melting, declared Professor Hans Almond, Swedish geologist. It may without exaggeration be said that the Greenland glaciers, like those in Norway, face the possibility of a catastrophic collapse. September 29, 1939. Scientists have confirmed the fact that the Arctic regions around Spitsbergen are warming up at a rate of approximately 1 degree in every 2 years. Since 1910, when observations first started in those regions, the cumulative rise of winter temperatures amounted to nearly 16 degrees. So the Arctic warmed up 16 degrees during a time when carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were very low. NASA now claims that Arctic winter warming is due to carbon dioxide, but obviously that is not true. Here's another article from 1940. Washington, the ice of the Arctic Ocean is melting so rapidly that more than 1/3 of it has disappeared in the last 50 years. May 31, 1947. Melting ice cap danger. If the Antarctic and Greenland ice caps should reduce at the same rate as they are at present melting, oceanic surfaces would rise to catastrophic proportions, and people living in the lowlands along the shores would be inundated. Dr. Allman added that temperatures in the Arctic have increased 10 degrees Fahrenheit since 1900, an enormous rise from the scientific standpoint. Again, this happened at low CO2 levels. People who blame Arctic warming on CO2 have no clue what they're talking about. February 18, 1952, melting ice caps mystery. Dr. William Carlson, an Arctic expert, said last night that polar ice caps were melting at an astonishing and unexplained rate and threatened to swamp seaports by raising ocean levels. The glaciers of Norway and Alaska, he said, are only half the size they were 50 years ago. The temperature around Spitsbergen is so modified that the sailing time has lengthened from 3 to 8 months of the year. Now let's go back to the Vinnikov graph. We've traced newspaper articles from the 1920s until the mid-1950s. There was a lot of melting going on, just as Vinnikov reported. And if the Vinnikov graph is correct, we should now start seeing articles about cooling and increasing ice. Let's take a look. And there it is, New York Times, January 30, 1961. Scientists agree world is colder. An assembly of specialists from several continents seems to have reached unanimous agreement on only one point. It is getting colder. July 18, 1963. Glaciers grow in Norway. Norway's glaciers are in the process of becoming thicker again after a period of 200 years of gradually melting down, according to glaciologist Mr. Olav Leistel. New York Times, July 18, 1970. U.S. and Soviet press studies of a colder Arctic. The United States and the Soviet Union are mounting large-scale investigations to determine why the Arctic climate is becoming more frigid, why parts of the Arctic sea ice have recently become ominously thicker, and whether the extent of that ice cover contributes to the onset of ice ages. April 14, 1973. Earth is cooling. Return of ice age is feared. Snowbanks cover areas of Baffin Island today which were seasonally snow-free 30 or 40 years before the present cooling. J.T. Andrews and his colleagues at the University of Colorado at Boulder report. Similarly, pack ice on Iceland is once again becoming the serious hindrance to navigation it was during the Little Ice Age of the 17th and 18th centuries. New York Times, January 5, 1978. International team of specialists finds no end in sight to 30-year cooling trend in Northern Hemisphere. A gradual increase in the area of the northern circumpolar vortex, the massive flow of frigid air around the Arctic, has been recorded by Doctors Angel and Korshover. In 1976, its southern extent was the greatest in 10 years, and last winter it was 1% larger than in any previous winter observed. Snow and ice cover in the northern hemisphere has varied greatly, but there's been a net increase according to a satellite photograph analysis by Dr. George Kukla of Columbia University. Now let's go locate this 1978 story on the Vinikoff graph. Well, there's 1978 on this graph, and you can see that Arctic sea ice was near its peak. All this melting and warming which occurred from the 1920s until the 1950s occurred at low carbon dioxide levels, whereas the freezing and increase in ice occurred at higher CO2 levels. It's very clear from the data that there's no correlation between Arctic sea ice behavior and carbon dioxide. The pattern is cyclical. Arctic sea ice decreased from the 1920s until the 1950s, it increased until the 1970s, and it's been decreasing again since the 1970s. NASA was completely wrong with their predictions about Arctic sea ice because they were based on a superstition about carbon dioxide rather than actual science. Then NASA piled up the junk science even deeper with more bogus claims about Arctic sea ice loss since 1958. Now let's look at what's actually going on with Arctic sea ice. The blue line shows Arctic sea ice extent for every day going back to January 1, 2006. Extent increases during the winter and it decreases during the summer. It does this year after year. The red line in this graph is the 365-day average. As you can see, despite all the hysteria from the press, Arctic sea ice has been very stable for the last 13 years. We keep hearing about how fast the Arctic is melting, but the exact opposite is true. Over the past month, Arctic sea ice growth has been the second highest on record. Last year was the highest on record. The green areas on this map show Arctic sea ice growth during November. As you can see, there's been a huge increase in ice over the past 25 days. NASA keeps pushing back their bogus predictions further and further in hopes that no one will remember. But I remember, and many others do too. Please spread this message to as many people as you can, and let's get this scam stopped. If we all work together, we can put an end to this mindless global warming hysteria. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.